Tron, Solar Sailor, released in 1982 for the Intellivision, the third of three such games released for the system based on the 1982 film Tron. And unlike Deadly Discs and Mesotron, which we looked at previously, Solar Sailor makes use of the IntelliVoice voice synthesis module. That's right, we're using the thing that powers B-17 bomber. And, well, IntelliVoice is a vital piece of the experience, so make sure that volume dial is all the way up because you'll be hearing some vital information spoken to you that will prove vital to the gameplay experience. And also have some pen and paper on hand because you're going to be writing things down.
Mattel Electronics presents Tron.
Yeah, just Tron for this one. I guess we couldn't be bothered with the full title. Anyways, we'll get the positives out of the way. There's a nice variety of voices in here. Apparently different people actually voiced different characters in this game. And while the quality is naturally a bit on the rough side and the lines are very brief, of course, that's a little more than what I was expecting out of this title.
Energy low.
Also, there's a little musical bit playing in the background that, let's be honest, is a bit annoying and not all that great, but hey, there's some background music in this here Intellivision game, combined with some basic sounding sound effects. That's kinda neat, I guess, I suppose. And, well, yeah, that's about all the positives there is to be had with Tron Solar Sailor, and how appropriate that we begin the week with Deadly Discs, the first and best of the three Tron games, and we end with this, quite possibly the worst of the three Tron games on Intellivision. I didn't think it'd get any worse than Mesotron, but folks, here we are. Solar Sailor is such a mess of a game that it makes Mesotron seem like Pac-Man in comparison, and I don't think I'm hyperbolizing anything when I say that this is quite possibly the absolute worst Intellivision game that I have ever played. And granted, I'm sure there are far worse games on the console out there that I haven't touched, and I want nothing to do with those, especially not after playing this because... Jesus Christ, where do I begin? Much like Mesotron, Solar Sailor has two phases of gameplay. The first phase places you in control of the eponymous Solar Sailor that you ride along these beams, and at the beginning of each stage, you're given a starting sector where your flares appear, which is always Sector 0, a destination sector which to sail to, and an access code that you'll need to enter upon reaching the target sector in order to move up a track along the computer world that will lead you closer to the master control program. That last piece of information, however, is given to you verbally and only verbally. So you either have to commit this code to memory or write it down on paper in the brief moment of time that the game gives you to write it down. Without this code, you cannot progress onwards, and if you forget the code, you need to return to Sector 0 and get another one to remember or write down. This is already asking more of the player than necessary, and we haven't even touched on the actual gameplay yet. So, in regards to the gameplay, you start out at Sector 0, and you have to guide your Solar Sailor to the target sector where you'll need to enter your verbally dictated access code at the white I/O beam to move up a track or two closer to the master control program, who awaits you on track 0. You're riding along the yellow beams, but will need to switch beams since energy is being drained from the beam as you're riding it. Once energy is depleted, the Solar Sailor stops moving and the game ends. There are minor enemies shooting back at you and their shots will drain energy from the beam you're on, but these are relatively harmless in the long run so long as you're able to switch beams. The only real threats are the recognizers that will come along and drag you back a track or two, thereby erasing any forward progress. Once moved to a new track by a recognizer, you'll need to return to Sector 0 to gain another access code since the previous one you attained will no longer be valid. Another constant danger is the need for energy, as verbal indicators will keep track of your energy levels on the current beam before warning you to get off the beam due to a lack of energy. Without energy, the Solar Sailor ceases to move and the game is over. So, and again, stop me if you've heard this before, but controls are the drizzling shits. And I really do mean it this time around. Conceptually, it's somewhat sound. You use the side buttons to control the speed of your sailor, acceleration, braking, that sort of thing, while the control disc is used to fire in multiple directions. You could have 2 shots on screen at a time, which is being somewhat generous. To switch beams, you'll need to press and hold any of the number keys from 1 to 6 before reaching an intersect point to jump beams. The issue here is that controls for beam switching are obscenely unresponsive. Sometimes you have to hold down a key in order to switch beams once you've reached a beam intersect point, but sometimes it won't register and you'll just move along the same beam. I've tried precise timing of button presses to switch beams, which have even less of a chance of working, and sometimes, out of nowhere, the sailor will switch beams on its own, almost as if the game is possessed. Perhaps the even bigger sticking point for me is that despite having 6 keys on the numpad dedicated to beam switching, you have virtually no guidance control over your sailor. That is to say, the sailor tends to turn in whichever direction it wants and usually where it's least convenient, such as going in the opposite direction of the sector you're aiming for. Now granted, this whole thing is on a loop, so you can go from Sector 0 to Sector 7 by going left and working your way backwards, but I'd like to be able to stick in a general direction, and having a solar sailor do its own thing when turning doesn't make the game any more challenging or fun, it just makes it more frustrating. And again, this is on top of having horrifically unresponsive controls that you need to rely on in order to operate the navigational abilities of your craft. The only thing that seems to work is the dialing of the numbers for the access code, but that's its own thing entirely. Now eventually, after several stages of track jumping, you'll reach the second phase of the game, which once again pits you against the master control program. Once again, a code is given to you verbally, and you'll need to catch the 1 bits and insert them into the proper positions on the bottom via the number pad in order to input the correct code and eventually win the game after building up enough energy to delete the program permanently. I wish I could show you more of this second phase beyond the brief demo footage that's playing here, but unfortunately I never made it this far, and truthfully I don't think it's worth the effort. Looks mildly interesting though, but I'd imagine it probably wouldn't play well either. Yeah, it paints a sad picture when the main portion of gameplay is so utterly broken and horrendous that you just decide to throw in the towel and not bother with the rest of it. I don't want to play as much of a game as possible before writing it off as whatever, but this was really sloppily put together. I don't want to say that Solar Sailor was lazily put together though. There was clearly a lot of thought that went behind the concept of the game that I feel was hampered by the execution. Figuring out how things work is obviously a hurdle without proper documentation, but you eventually get around that and smarten yourself up eventually on how to play the game. It's when things don't work, the controls in particular, that you really begin to sour on a game that is already asking too much of the player, memorizing codes that are given to you verbally or writing them down on paper, without giving them the proper tools to produce any semblance of satisfactory results that could result in an enjoyable experience. I mean, look, I've commented on the voices and they're fine. The music is constantly looping and gets tiresome after a while, but credit where it's due. There is a musical bit taken from the original score for whatever that's worth. Visually, it's a bit of a mess. You could sort of make out a Solar Sailor outline thing on the track, and they recycled the recognizers from the last game, but the rest of it is just a jumbled mess with colored grids and random shape things. The second phase looks a bit nicer, but that's about it really. It is amazing that Mattel put so much stock in Tron back in the day that they made 3 games based on the property for the Intellivision to varying degrees of degrading quality. We started off with Deadly Discs, which despite some issues turned out to be the best of the 3 games, and the rest was downhill from there. Tron turned out to be a case of frustrating tedium, and as far as today's game Solar Sailor is concerned, when the strongest aspect of a game is the primitive, rough-sounding vocal bits coming out of an expansion module, it doesn't exactly paint an overall pretty picture. Something this high concept needed proper care to ensure everything worked properly, and with controls being the way they are, broken, unresponsive, practically worthless, that clearly wasn't the case here, and the end result is a game that I could safely say that out of all the Intellivision games that I've played thus far, and I concede it hasn't been that many, Tron Solar Sailor ranks up there as the absolute worst of the bunch. This is one game that is best served greeting programs in the trash bin. And if there is a lesson to be learned from all of this, and any big takeaway I got from this Tron trilogy of games, it's that I probably should have stuck with Deadly Discs on the 2600 instead. I should probably play more of that. In fact, I think I'm going to do that right now. Anyway, good night. See you in October.